They called it the ghost front. I'd seen hell in the Hurtgen, smelled the sickly sweet scent of rotting pine needles and spilled guts. That was chaos, yes, but it was predictable chaos. It had rules. You advanced an inch, they took it back an inch. It was a slow, grinding consumption. But the real terror, the kind that eats you from the inside out, begins when you realize the generals have looked at your map reference, tagged your sector, quiet, and decided you're no longer a priority. They didn't see the silence. They saw an empty column on a logistics sheet, a place to dump replacement troops, and let the combat veterans thaw out their souls. I was Sergeant Major J.R. McAllister, Mac to the few men who remembered my full name. Supply, logistics, and trying to make sense of the nonsense delivered from above. I was 50 miles behind the thin crust of the 28th Infantry, the bloody bucket boys who'd been fed through the Hurtgen grinder and spat out here to convalesce. The cold was the first thing that got to you. It wasn't the dry, sharp cold of the high desert. This was the deep, damp, suffocating cold of the Ardennes, a blanket woven from freezing fog and ancient pine shadows that settled into your bones and stayed there, leaching the warmth out of your marrow. The snow had started a week ago, fat, heavy flakes that had muted the entire world. It looked pristine, like a Christmas card drafted by a lunatic. But under that white surface, the mud and the despair were waiting. My current station was a repurposed Belgian farmhouse, smelling perpetually of coal smoke, wet wool, and the faint, metallic tang of stale coffee. I was sitting on a crate, running my thumb over the edge of a new sheaf of requisitions. Forms. The war at my level was mostly forms. S4 requests, casualty reports, fuel projections. I tried to focus on the numbers. This was my sanctuary. Numbers don't lie. The paperwork said we had 3 days' supply of rations, adequate heavy winter gear, a lie, we were always short, and a full complement of artillery shells, a verifiable falsehood. Everything was theoretical. Everything was a comforting illusion created by men sitting in warm rooms in Paris. Mac? You still filing forms, or are you actually going to check the radio antennae? It was Corporal Davies, my youngest, and only, full-time assistant. Davies was 19, built like a shovel, and perpetually optimistic. An anomaly in this place. I'm prioritizing, Davies, I muttered, without looking up. If we run out of K rations, the men get hungry. If we run out of these forms, Command thinks we don't exist, and then we starve. Davies didn't laugh. He knew I was half serious. My job was to make sure the stream of beans, bullets, and bandages didn't stop, even when the front line evaporated. Right now, the stream felt more like a slow, constipated drip. We were resting the 28th here, true, but resting them against what? The line was held by green, exhausted, or half-trained divisions. The landscape itself, the thick, impenetrable forests and the tangled gorges, was supposed to be our defense. Command believed the roads were too poor, the terrain too rough for any serious German mechanized movement. The consensus was ironclad. The Germans were beaten. They were burning boys and old men in the east. They couldn't possibly mount an offense in the west. But I had seen the captured maps. I had interrogated the stragglers. The captured troops were ghosts, yes, malnourished, often freezing, but their eyes were empty of fear and full of something much worse. Total, absolute conviction. They hadn't surrendered because they were beaten. They had surrendered because they ran out of things to shoot. I finished signing the last requisition for 100-octane fuel, knowing perfectly well we wouldn't see it for a week. I pushed the papers away. Davies grabbed the thermos. Let's go check on that radio relay. I keep hearing a flutter on the high-frequency band, something the boys up north aren't supposed to be running. The moment I stepped outside, the cold clamped down. It wasn't just cold, it was aggressive. the kind that made the rubber on the tires squeak like distressed animals. The sky was a heavy, low ceiling of unbroken gray cloud, pressing down on the trees. The world was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic chug of our ancient generator. That silence was a lie. It was a vacuum before the explosion. I climbed into the back of our utility truck, a beaten-up Dodge WC-51, with Davies. He cranked the engine. It caught after 3 painful attempts, coughing a plume of black smoke into the pristine air. The vibrations of the engine were familiar, comforting. A tangible, working machine. "Mac," Davies said, squinting into the gloom. "It feels different, doesn't it?" "The cold, Davies, always feels different when you're out of bed." "No, I mean the air. It's too still. Like waiting for thunder." I looked out at the thick, dark trees that pressed in on all sides of the narrow Belgian road. This forest, the deep, dark, whispering Ardennes, had swallowed armies before. Now, it felt like it was holding its breath. I reached over, flipping the safety off on my M1 carbine, resting it across my lap. A formality. I hadn't needed it for months. I didn't know then that the massive, catastrophic storm we were waiting for wasn't coming from the sky. It was already gathered on the ground, just beyond the line of exhausted infantry, preparing to hit the soft belly of the American complacency. And in 2 hours, that silence would be ripped apart by a sound that would redefine the word fear for an entire generation. The sector of the 28th was treated like a convalescent home for battered units, a place where the American line was stretched thinnest, held by scattered battalion command posts, and a few fixed artillery emplacements primarily used for harassing fire, more to keep the green troops awake than to actually suppress any serious enemy activity. That afternoon, before the world fractured, I sat in on a standard daily briefing. Routine, dreary, and profoundly arrogant. Lieutenant Colby, a fresh-faced Yale man whose tactical experience was limited to a few skirmishes and endless map study, stood stiffly by a grease pencil map. "Gentlemen, the enemy situation remains static," Colby announced, tapping his pointer on the central road network near St. Vith. "We are detecting minimal activity. Fuel shortages in the Reich are crippling their mobility. Air reconnaissance reports confirm that any major German reserve elements are committed in the east, or are locked down defending the Rhine bridges." He straightened his back, radiating confidence. "The assessment remains. The Wehrmacht is broken. They are utilizing this sector defensively, throwing out sporadic patrols to harass our forward observation posts, but nothing indicative of offensive capability. This is, and will remain, the Ghost Front. Our current deployment is optimized for comfort and integration of replacement personnel." He meant that our division was functioning as an extended, understrength training camp. I leaned back on my crate, rubbing the grit from my eyes. Comfort. The word tasted like ash. I looked around the makeshift briefing room. Half the men were barely awake, slumped over their maps, dreaming of hot showers and USO shows. They wanted to believe Colby. They needed to believe him. When the lieutenant asked for questions, I raised my hand. Colby sighed visibly. He hated my questions because they were always rooted in the gritty, uncomfortable reality of logistics, not the clean theory of map maneuvers. "Sergeant Major McAllister. Supply concerns, I assume?" "No, Lieutenant. Operational intelligence. I'm just curious why our radio intercepts are picking up chatter indicative of heavy tracked vehicle movement in the Schnee-Eifel area. Not sporadic. Consistent. And why the local partisans have been reporting increased rail traffic moving west towards the border, only to have their reports dismissed as unsubstantiated rumor." Colby gave me the patient, condescending smile reserved for non-commissioned officers who dared to think beyond their pay grade. "Sergeant Major, those tracked vehicles are likely isolated movements of local self-propelled guns or light armor being repositioned. As for the rail traffic, The Germans are moving anything they can to defend the industrial Ruhr. It's defensive redeployment, not an offensive buildup. Their logistics are utterly crippled. Where would they get the hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel required for a massed armor attack through this terrain? He tapped the map again, his pointer landing on the convoluted mess of forest tracks. The terrain favors us. Any massed assault would be choked out within miles. We have strategic air supremacy, even if the weather's currently grounded the Thundercats. That was the core of the illusion, the American faith in overwhelming industrial power. General Staff measured victory in tons of steel, gallons of gasoline, and the number of P-47s available. The German will, the fanatical, almost suicidal German refusal to accept mathematical defeat, was discounted as an irrelevant variable. We knew the factories of Detroit could outproduce the entire Reich. But we forgot that sheer will, when packaged with desperation and surprise, could briefly overcome the logic of the balance sheet. I shut my mouth. Arguing was pointless. The generals wanted to believe the enemy was dead. They had moved into France and Belgium, tasted the pleasures of liberated cities, and they were tired. They had achieved psychological victory. Now they just wanted the physical war to end without fuss. Later that evening, the snow intensified. It fell in vertical sheets, turning the window panes into frosted white screens. I went outside to try and coax another hour of life out of the Dodge's battery. I loved that truck. It was ugly, temperamental, but dependable. My only connection to the outside world, my mobile office, my lifeline. I had just finished tightening a loose connection when I heard a familiar sound, faint but distinct, cutting through the intensifying wind. It wasn't the crack of a sniper rifle. It wasn't the distant boom of routine artillery. It was the low, purposeful rumble of heavy tracks. Not one, not two, but a deep, resonant growl that felt like it was traveling through the earth itself, not the air. It was the collective sound of something enormous and metal moving in formation, not 5 miles from our forward positions. I froze, wiping the oil from my hands. Davies was inside, humming a Christmas tune. The sound faded quickly, swallowed by the storm. It could have been anything. A truck convoy. A heavy maintenance unit. But the rumble was too low, too steady. It had the weight of serious armor. I walked back inside, past Davies, and picked up the field phone, dialing the number for the forward observation post of Company G. It rang 8 times. 9. 10. Finally, a tired, static-ridden voice answered. Company G, Private Jenkins, speak fast. Sergeant Major McAllister, supply. Jenkins, are you hearing anything unusual up there? Define unusual, Sarge. We got wind, snow, and a persistent goddamn whistling that sounds like my old man's bad lungs. Wait. Hold on. Silence crackled over the line. I heard a muffled exchange, then a sudden, sharp cry, cut off immediately. Jenkins? What was that? More silence. Then a brief, terrifying burst of machine gun fire, a heavy weapon, definitely German, unmistakable in its rhythm, followed by the sound of glass breaking. The line went dead with a metallic pop. I stood there, the phone heavy in my hand. Jenkins didn't hang up. He had been erased. I looked at the map. The position of Company G. It was supposed to be completely secure, behind a minefield, well within the safety zone. Davies! Get your boots on! We're breaking down the radio equipment now. We're going to Bastogne. Davies' humming stopped. He looked at me, seeing the professional fear I couldn't hide. What's in Bastogne, Mac? It's just another supply depot. Right now, Davies, I said, grabbing my service pistol and stuffing a box of ammunition into my greatcoat pocket. It's the only place big enough to hold onto. I didn't know it yet, but the German assault had already begun. The thunder was no longer distant. It was right outside the door, and it was about to kick the door in. The first shell hit not 5 minutes after we started packing the delicate SCR-300 radio gear into its shockproof containers. It was a massive 150 millimeters. It didn't just explode. It annihilated the barn 30 yards away, where our reserve rations were stored. The farmhouse shook violently, spraying dust and splintered plaster. It was not a scouting shot. It was a sighting round, aimed at the command post. "Down!" I yelled, pulling Davies into the relative safety of the stone fireplace chimney. The barrage that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my 5 years of service. It was a solid, continuous wave of sound and pressure. The air wasn't just filled with explosions. It was a pressurized, vibrating medium that tried to crush your lungs. I recognized the distinctive crack of German 88s, the whining approach of multiple rocket launchers, the naval warfares, and the deeper, sickening thump of heavy mortars. Where was the logic? Where was the fuel shortage? The lack of ammunition? This was the kind of sustained, mass fire that only a fully stocked, prepared army could deliver. This was Berlin throwing its last, spiteful tantrum, using every round they had saved for a single, overwhelming blow. "Mac! They know where we are!" Davies screamed, trying to be heard over the continuous roar. "Of course, they know. They had months to plan this." I grabbed the most critical items, the crypto logs, the maps detailing the routes around the St. Vith bottleneck, the disassembled radio set, and my carbine. Everything else, the piles of requisitions, the routine of my life, was already gone, buried under debris. We burst outside. The generator was still chugging, a brave, foolish machine. But the perimeter was already lost. The sky was alight with the flashes of distant guns. The trees, previously pristine, were now skeletal shadows against the constant flashes. We could hear the chaotic sounds of battle, but too close. Not miles away. Hundreds of yards away. Our own small command unit, a dozen men, mostly clerks and drivers, was scattering. Fear is an infectious disease, and it was spreading fast. I saw Major Ellison, a good man, but a terrible soldier, running towards the woods, his helmet rolling off his head. "Major! The radio logs! We have to secure the codes!" Ellison didn't hear me. He was gone, swallowed by the snow and the terror. I ran to the Dodge. It was our only hope of egress. Davies jumped into the driver's seat and frantically tried to start the engine. "Come on, you damn heap of American steel! Come on!" The engine coughed once, twice, then died. "Battery's dead. The shaking must have loosened the terminal again." I grabbed the heavy crank from the toolbox. The shelling hadn't stopped. I could hear small arms fire getting closer, MG-42s, the infamous Hitler's buzzsaws, chattering a death sentence. I jammed the crank into the starting hole, ignoring the vibrating earth beneath my feet. This was not heroism. This was instinct. A logistician's fight. If the engine dies, the mission fails. I threw my weight onto the crank. It caught, then slipped, wrenching my shoulder. I tasted blood in my mouth. A shell landed 50 yards down the road, closer than the last one. I could feel the heat. I tried again. One more time. A prayer to Detroit. V-room. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, ugly noise. "Go, Davies! Now! Head southwest. Stay off the main roads. We're aiming for the Bastogne salient." Davies slammed the truck into gear. We lurched onto the narrow forest track. As we sped away from the annihilation, I risked a look back. The farmhouse was already engulfed in smoke and fire. But what shocked me most was the speed of the enemy's advance. Through the gaps in the trees I saw them. Not disorganized infantry patrols. Not old men on bicycles. They were steel monsters. Panzers. At least 3 of them, moving with ruthless efficiency along the supposedly impassable dirt road. They were dark shapes against the snow, their long guns swinging with predatory certainty. They were not looking for a fight. They were looking for a route to run over us. My professional mind kicked in, cold and detached, overriding the panic. They have fuel. They have ammunition. They have massed armor superiority at the point of attack. All the reports, all the comforting lies told in the briefing room, shattered instantly. We had been hit by a sledgehammer, not a light tap. The Ghost Front was dead. In its place, the entire Western Front was collapsing into a bloody, chaotic mess we would soon call the Bulge. And we were in the middle of it, carrying a few pounds of sensitive paperwork in a light utility truck, fleeing from a full-scale panzer division. The realization hit me. This wasn't an attack. This was a breakout. The Germans weren't trying to gain ground. They were trying to win the war in 3 days. And if they reached the Meuse River, they just might. Fleeing was a messy business. Not the strategic withdrawal taught in manuals, but a pure, unadulterated scramble for survival. The road we took, a mere logging track, was quickly filling with debris and the human jetsam of the shattered 28th Division. The panic was palpable, thick as the freezing fog. Trucks were abandoned, sometimes still running, blocking the way. Soldiers, separated from their units, wandered blindly, their eyes wide and fixed on nothing. They weren't fighting. They were stunned. The sheer velocity and ferocity of the German advance had simply overloaded their ability to cope. They hadn't been defeated. They had been mathematically eliminated before the fight even began. "Davies, slow up. We can't hit that 3/4 ton or we're stuck." Davies, his face pale and strained, expertly maneuvered the Dodge around a burning medical truck. The smell of burning rubber and kerosene mixed with the sharp, clean scent of the pine trees, creating an unbearable, sickly perfume of devastation. I watched the faces of the soldiers we passed. They were young mostly, the replacements that had been rushed here straight out of basic training. They had been told they were facing a defeated enemy. Now they saw German armor where there should have been none, and they felt betrayed. My mind, however, was running purely on logistics, cold and professional. It was the only way to hold on to sanity. I was analyzing the failure, calculating the disaster. Resource allocation. The Germans had achieved total surprise by pooling every last resource: fuel, ammunition, elite armored divisions, the Panzer Lehr, the Waffen-SS, for the single, desperate thrust. Operational tempo. They were moving faster than intelligence had ever predicted possible in this terrain. This meant 2 things. They had prepositioned supply dumps, or they were operating on the assumption they would capture ours. The latter was terrifying. Air cover. The unbroken layer of heavy cloud cover was the strategic key. The strategic air supremacy that Colby had so blithely relied upon was zeroed out. The sky, our greatest asset, had been neutralized by the weather. We were fighting a ground war, man to man, tank to tank, and suddenly the odds weren't so comforting. "They didn't just guess where we were weak, Mac," I murmured to myself, watching a platoon of demoralized men stumble past, dragging their rifles. "They chose the line of least resistance, and they'd brought enough steel to make that line disappear." Davies glanced at me, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. "Look, Mac. They're trying to set up." A few hundred yards ahead, a small knot of men, maybe a dozen from the 28th, led by a wiry captain who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, were desperately trying to deploy a light anti-tank gun of 57 millimeters. It looked pathetic, a toy against the panzers I had glimpsed. I knew the drill. They would hold for 10 minutes, maybe 15, and then they would be overrun, creating a bottleneck that would stop our movement. "Don't stop, Davies," I ordered. "We can't help them." We have to get these codes to Bastogne. It was a monstrous order, the kind that separates the professional soldier from the human being. Every instinct screamed to stop, to fight, to share a cigarette with those doomed men. But the codes, the communication linchpin of the entire southern shoulder, were more important than their lives or mine. They were the key to organizing the counterpunch. We barreled past the captain. He looked at us, his face a mask of exhaustion and confusion, probably wondering why a supply sergeant was running away from the fight. I didn't blame him. I was running from the inevitable. Suddenly, the roar of the engines intensified behind us. Not the Dodge's engine. A low, grinding, high-powered sound. "Tiger, Mac! It's a tiger, right on our tail!" Davies yelled, pushing the accelerator to the floor. The old Dodge rattled violently, protesting the speed. We hit a patch of ice. The truck fishtailed wildly, scraping the side of a pine tree before Davies managed to straighten it out. I looked back. The tiger was massive, moving through the forest with frightening ease. It wasn't driving fast, but its sheer momentum meant it closed the distance quickly. The 88mm gun barrel looked like the yawning throat of a hungry dragon. "They're not aiming for us, Davies!" I realized, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They're clearing the road? We're just in their way!" The tank opened fire. Not at us, but at the anti-tank position ahead. The blast was deafening, a blinding flash of orange and black against the snow. The 57mm gun and the men around it simply ceased to exist. They were vaporized. We had seconds. We reached the point of impact. Davies swerved violently around a smoking crater and what was left of the men. I gripped the carbine tightly, staring at the horror. That was the professional epiphany. This wasn't a battle. It was an extermination. The Germans weren't fighting for territory. They were moving to a timetable, and anything that stood in their way was eliminated with ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency. We were an annoyance, a calculation to be solved with high-explosive shells. We sped deeper into the twisting forest tracks, the sound of the tiger slowly receding as it barreled past the point we had turned off. We were safe, for now, but we were completely cut off. I checked my map. Bastogne was south, through miles of forest, crossed by streams and secondary roads that the Germans would soon control. The weather had saved us from air attack, but it had also turned the entire region into a blinding, snow-choked maze. I patted the box containing the codes, damp with sweat. We had to keep moving. The chaos was only beginning, and the Germans hadn't even unleashed their secret weapon yet, the psychological warfare that would break the fragile trust between Allied soldiers. The deeper we got into the secondary roads, the more terrifying the breakdown of command became. We passed through small Belgian villages that had seen no fighting, yet their inhabitants were huddled indoors, their shutters closed, their faces gray with fear. They knew something we didn't. The German counterattack was not just a military operation. It was a sudden, violent reimposition of terror. We drove for hours, the truck running on fumes and sheer stubbornness. The silence returned, but this time it was a predatory silence, the quiet of the hunter stalking prey. The true nature of the German surprise operation, known as Griffin, dawned on us slowly, like a creeping disease. We first noticed the signs of sabotage. Road signs pointing the wrong way. A critical bridge, previously reported intact, was blown, not by enemy fire, but by carefully placed internal charges. "Who the hell blew that bridge, Mac? The Germans haven't gotten this far south," Davies exclaimed, slamming on the brakes. We were forced to backtrack 5 precious miles. "Not German soldiers, Davies. German saboteurs," I replied, my voice raspy. "Look at the explosion. Too clean. Too targeted. That was the work of explosives experts, operating behind our lines." The fear escalated when we reached a makeshift checkpoint, manned by 3 weary, nervous military police, wearing the insignia of the 9th Armored Division. They looked stressed, their weapons held too tightly. We pulled up slowly. I rolled down the window. "Sergeant Major McAllister, Logistics. We're heading to Bastogne." One of the MPs, a big, red-faced man, stepped forward. "Halt. Identification and password." I showed him my ID. "The password is Bakersfield." The MP nodded, his eyes darting around the forest line. "And the countersign?" "Nuts," I said automatically, the established countersign for the day. The MP hesitated. His eyes narrowed slightly. "That's yesterday's countersign, Sergeant Major. What's the real one?" A cold knot formed in my stomach. The passwords changed at midnight. It was currently 1,400 hours. The daily password was a city. The countersign was a baseball team. "The real countersign is Yankees," I corrected, feeling a profound wave of relief that I hadn't made a fatal mistake. But the MP didn't relax. He kept staring at me, his hand hovering over his sidearm. "Okay, McAllister. You seem to know your stuff. But we're checking everyone. Who won the World Series in 1943? That question was wrong. It wasn't standard procedure. Standard procedure involved military codes, not trivia. "The Yankees, obviously," I said, trying to sound bored. "Who pitched the winning game?" the MP pressed, ignoring my impatience. "Look, son, I don't follow baseball. I follow fuel projections. Now move the cones. We have classified material." The MP didn't move. He gestured to the other 2 MPs, who now had their rifles trained on us. "McAllister, you're coming with us. We have orders to detain anyone who seems suspicious. We've had reports of Kraut commandos dressed like Americans, using perfect English, even knowing the passwords." The terror was manufactured by design. Otto Skorzeny's commandos, dressed in captured American uniforms and equipped with our vehicles, were not meant to win battles, but to shatter trust. To force Americans to check identity, delay movement, and fear their own allies. Total paralysis. I gripped the carbine on my lap, my knuckles white. If I tried to fight, they would shoot me. If I let them detain me, I'd never get the codes to Bastogne. The MP stepped closer. "Empty your pockets, slow." Suddenly, Davy shouted, his voice high and strained. "Wait! What state is the capital of Kansas in?" The MP paused, momentarily distracted by the nonsensical question. "Kansas, obviously. What kind of a stupid question is that?" I watched the MP. He had an American uniform, an American weapon, and spoke fluent English. But Davies, bless his young, observant soul, had caught the flaw. "The capital of Kansas is Topeka," Davies said, his voice now dangerously calm. "And the capital of the state of Kansas is Topeka, Kansas. It's a trick question, Corporal." The MP's eyes flickered. A tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation. That was all I needed. A non-American speaker, even a fluent one, often mistakes American geography trivia. "Wrong answer, soldier," I barked, pulling my pistol and firing a single round into the dirt at the MP's feet. The distraction was enough. The big MP instinctively flinched, drawing his weapon. In that millisecond, I slammed the accelerator, reaching over Davies, and the Dodge shot forward, scattering the cones. As we sped past, I heard the distinctive, high-pitched chatter of an MP-40. The German submachine gun. Not an American Thompson or grease gun. "They were Krauts, Mac. They were actually Krauts," Davies shouted, adrenaline coursing through him. I didn't answer. I just kept driving, peering into the woods. The uniform was meaningless. The language was meaningless. The only thing that mattered was instinct, and the small, crucial details of identity that only a native, or a seasoned logistician like me could spot. They had not only penetrated our line, they had started dissolving the fabric of trust that held the American army together. We were alone, surrounded by an enemy who could wear our faces. Night fell early, brutally. The sky remained choked by low clouds, preventing the moon or stars from offering any light. The darkness was absolute, thick, and freezing. We were driving blind, navigating by memory and the dim, shielded glow of the map under the truck's dashboard. The cold had become a physical entity, a cruel partner in the back of the truck, laughing at our inadequate wool uniforms. The temperature had dropped well below zero, freezing the oil in the gearboxes and making the very metal of the truck brittle. Every breath was a shallow, painful gasp. If we stopped, we would freeze. Sleep was not an option. It was a slow, deliberate form of suicide. Davies, exhausted but driven by pure survival instinct, hunched over the wheel. "How much gas do we have, Mac?" he whispered. I checked the gauge. The needle was hovering just above E. "Enough for maybe 20 more miles if we take it easy. We need a refill, or we need to ditch the truck and move on foot." Moving on foot was unthinkable. The codes were cumbersome, and we were already starting to suffer from early frostbite on our extremities. We needed the speed and shelter of the Dodge. The strategic target of the German offensive, Antwerp and the Meuse River crossings, made perfect sense from a logistical perspective. Deny the Americans fuel and port facilities, and the entire Western Front grinds to a halt. We were heading towards Bastogne, a tiny Belgian town that was now, suddenly, the fulcrum of the entire American defense in the south. It was crucial because of its road network. 7 major roads converged there. If Bastogne fell, the German lines of communication would be secured, and the bulge would become a total breakthrough. I was focused on the immediate supply chain, water. The coffee in the thermos had frozen into a solid block hours ago. Our canteen was useless. "Davies, when we hit that next crossroads, we turn east. There's an old farmhouse. Maybe we can find a cistern, or at least some kindling." We found the farmhouse, but it offered no respite. It was already occupied by a squad of American infantry, who looked like they were on the verge of mutiny. They were frozen, hungry, and terrified. "Who the hell are you?" The sergeant in charge, a man named Taggart, challenged us, his rifle leveled. "Logistics. We need shelter for 5 minutes and some water. We're heading to Bastogne." Taggart laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Bastogne? That place is surrounded, Sergeant Major. We've been trying to get through for 12 hours. Every road is blocked by crowd checkpoints or burning jeeps. The command is gone. We're cut off. We're waiting for morning to see which way the wind blows." His words confirmed my worst fears. The perimeter of the initial collapse was already solidified. Bastogne was now an island. I walked over to the fire they had built in the hearth. It was pitifully small, consuming wood too quickly. I looked at the sergeant. "You have rations, Sergeant. Half a box of K's for 10 men. We're supposed to wait for a supply drop that isn't coming." I opened my field pack. I still had 2 full cans of sea rations, reserved for emergency. I handed them over. Taggart stared at the cans as if they were gold bars. "Why? You need those. I need to make Bastogne. You need to keep your men alive long enough to defend this ridge when the crowds find you. Eat them now. You're useless frozen." I didn't stay long enough for thanks. The atmosphere was too toxic, too saturated with failure. I needed the professionalism and the discipline of men who still believed in the chain of command, even if that chain was hanging by a thread. We refilled our tank from a hidden 50-gallon drum Taggart showed me, a precious, illegal stash, and drove off, leaving the small fire and the despair behind. As we continued, I experienced the strange, surreal disconnect of war. The map showed neat roads and distances. Reality was a landscape of broken promises. We passed the wreckage of a tank column, American Shermans, not knocked out by heavy artillery, but ambushed at a choke point. The bodies were frozen stiff, leaning against the turrets, their faces fixed in expressions of agony. I focused on the details. The precise way the shells had penetrated the Shermans, the telltale scorch marks of the German high-velocity rounds. It was a textbook, ruthless exploitation of their superior armor and our complacency. Davies was silent, driving like a machine. I knew he was close to breaking. "Why, Mac?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible above the engine drone. "Why did the generals let this happen? How could they think the Germans were done?" I sighed, the freezing air burning my lungs. "They mistook exhaustion for surrender, Davies. They forgot that when you push a wounded animal into a corner, it doesn't just lie down and die. It launches one last, desperate, perfect attack. And the generals, Davies? They started measuring victory in resources, forgetting that victory is ultimately measured in how many men are willing to stay and freeze in a hole when every fiber of their being tells them to run." We pushed on, towards the flickering promise of order in Bastogne, an order that was about to be put to the ultimate test of human endurance. It was the morning of the 19th of December when we reached the outskirts of Bastogne. 3 days of relentless flight, frozen solid, living on adrenaline and the fumes of stolen gasoline. The clouds had briefly parted during the night, offering a mocking view of the relentless starlight, but now the heavy blanket was back, promising more snow and sealing the German advantage. The difference in Bastogne was immediate, stark, and almost unbelievable. The chaos of the retreating 28th Division had given way to the organized fury of the 101st Airborne. The Screaming Eagles had been rushed in, driving through the disintegrating front lines. They hadn't arrived fully equipped, but they had arrived with something far more valuable: discipline and the brutal determination of paratroopers who specialized in fighting surrounded. The town itself was a maelstrom of activity, yet somehow controlled. Medics were running triage in the church. Engineers were blowing up bridges and establishing hasty roadblocks, and soldiers were digging in with bayonets and shovels into the frozen soil, creating a hard, ugly perimeter. We pulled up to the central command post, a hastily fortified cellar beneath a large barracks building. Davies was barely conscious. I shoved him towards a medic with an order for hot coffee and immediate attention for his frostbitten fingers. I, meanwhile, presented myself to the military police. My uniform was torn, my face streaked with soot and unshaven stubble. I probably looked like a German infiltrator myself. "Sergeant Major McAllister, 28th Logistics. I have operational cipher material for the command staff." I was quickly ushered into the command post. The cellar was crowded, illuminated by harsh, flickering gasoline lamps. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the electric tension of men operating on the razor's edge of endurance. At the center stood Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. He was a small, intense man, surrounded by his staff. There was no panic here, only intense, professional focus. Maps were spread out on crates, covered in red and blue grease pencil marks. The situation was grim, but the men here were analyzing it, not succumbing to it. I laid the heavy box of cipher logs on the map table. "McAllister, thank God. We need those logs," said a major, snatching them up immediately. "The 28th was supposed to get these out 3 days ago. We were a little busy, Major. The initial shock was total. They came through the Schnee Eifel like a scythe. We saw panthers and tigers pushing right through the wreckage of the line." McAuliffe looked at me sharply, his eyes piercing. "Sergeant Major, tell us what you saw. Cut the dramatics. Logistics, what's their resupply capability looking like?" They're running on fumes, correct? I stood at attention, trying to ignore the deep tremor of exhaustion running through my body. General, with respect, your intelligence assessment is wrong. They are not running on fumes. They were not supposed to be able to move this fast through the Ardennes. They are moving because they established forward supply dumps, or they are counting on capturing ours. More critically, the roads are now completely saturated with enemy armor. They are not holding back. They committed everything. I traced the projected German axis of advance on the map with a trembling finger. They are bypassing Bastogne. Their goal is the Meuse. They are using this city as an unavoidable anchor point. If they neutralize us here, their logistics train flows immediately toward Antwerp. They don't want to stop and fight us. They want to circle us and let us wither on the vine. The room went silent. The general nodded slowly, absorbing the brutal truth. So, you're saying they have achieved total encirclement? It is complete, sir. I saw the wreckage of our own attempts to penetrate the line coming in. We are an island of American steel and flesh, surrounded by German desperation. McAuliffe stood up straight, folding his arms. The movement was sharp and definitive. He had the information, and now he had to act on it. Very well, Sergeant Major. You delivered your package. Get some rest. You'll be assigned to logistics support here. We'll need every man who knows how to count rations. Rest. The word felt foreign and obscene. But I stumbled towards the nearest cot, my professional mission completed. I collapsed, but sleep was impossible. The relentless thump-thump of the incoming German artillery, now a dull, continuous rhythm, was the new soundtrack to our isolation. The next 2 days blurred into a continuum of frozen misery and desperate logistical calculations. My expertise was suddenly critical. I wasn't fighting the enemy with bullets. I was fighting him with inventory sheets. We were critically short on everything: fuel, medical supplies, and most importantly, heavy-caliber artillery shells. The 101st had been rushed here with only light equipment. We were rationing rounds for the 105mm howitzers. Every shell had to count. The weather held, a blessing for the Germans, a curse for us. The fog and cloud ceiling were still too low for the desperately needed resupply drops from the American Air Force. We were starving, freezing, and running out of things to shoot. My new function involved trying to find hidden caches of fuel and food in the cellars of Belgian homes. It was grueling, unrewarding work, accompanied by the constant, chilling awareness that the German ring was tightening. They were sending probing attacks, testing the defenses, but they knew we were trapped. Time was on their side. On the morning of December 22nd, the inevitable happened. A small German patrol, led by 2 officers, approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They were guided blindfolded to the command post cellar. I was there, compiling a report on the alarming rate of frostbite casualties, which were now outstripping combat casualties. I watched the 2 German officers, clean, well-fed, and radiating the arrogant confidence of the aggressor, stand before McAuliffe. The atmosphere in the room was electric. Hope mingled with fear. Was this a ceasefire? Were they offering terms? A message, typed in formal German, was presented to McAuliffe. The interpreter, a nervous major, began to read aloud. To the USA commander of the encircled troops at Bastogne. The German commander. It is hereby ordered that you surrender the town of Bastogne in order to spare the lives of your men and the inhabitants of Bastogne. The alternative is the total annihilation of the town and all troops within. All fighting will cease upon acceptance of this demand. Silence descended. Total, crushing silence. McAuliffe took the paper, reread the demands, and then passed it to his chief of staff. He paused for what felt like an eternity, sipping his coffee, his expression unreadable. He wasn't contemplating surrender. He was calculating the morale impact of the answer. Finally, he looked at the German major, the interpreter, and stated with the calm authority of a man ordering lunch. "Translate this to the German commander." "Nuts!" the interpreter stammered. "Sir?" "The correct translation, General." "Do you mean go to hell?" "No," McAuliffe said, standing up. "I mean exactly what I said. NTS, get them out of here, Major." The German officers were led away, completely bewildered by the vulgar brevity of the response. But for the men in the command post, the tension broke. A wave of nervous, hysterical laughter swept the cellar. It was the only possible answer to the absurdity of the situation. It was defiance encapsulated in a single, perfect, American vulgarity. For me, McAllister the pragmatist, it was more than bravado. It was strategy. McAuliffe had just told the men and the enemy that there would be no discussion, no surrender, and no retreat. This was the final stand, the ultimate commitment. The battle for Bastogne would not be won by superior firepower, which we lacked, or by maneuver, which we couldn't execute. It would be won or lost by sheer, stubborn, frozen refusal. We were now fighting not for ground, but for time. Time for the weather to break. Time for Patton's Third Army to pivot north. That afternoon, the German artillery resumed with renewed intensity. The insult had been delivered, and the enemy was now tasked with delivering the promised annihilation. The artillery barrage that followed the nuts reply was the most concentrated the town had yet endured. It was a precise, professional attempt to level the town and break the will of the defenders. My mission changed from mere inventory to damage control and resource allocation under fire. I was moving constantly, dodging shell fragments, trying to make the impossible mathematics of survival work. One of our biggest problems was the field hospital, set up in a schoolhouse near the southern perimeter. It was overwhelmed. We had run out of whole blood and pain medication hours ago. Casualties were being treated on mattresses ripped from the school dormitory, laid out on cold, stone floors. I was tasked with bringing the last functional generator and the few remaining rolls of plaster to the school. Davies, pale but determined, drove. The moment we arrived, the German infantry launched a probing attack against the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment holding the nearby perimeter. It wasn't a main thrust, but it was violent. A vicious flurry of grenades and automatic weapons fire, aimed at overrunning the hospital and creating a breach. We abandoned the truck and sprinted towards the schoolhouse. Inside, the noise was unbearable. Screaming men, the metallic clatter of medical instruments, and the constant thump-thump of incoming mortar rounds. "Get the generator running! Now!" I yelled at Davies, pointing to the power hookup. I looked around for the officer in charge. The situation was critical. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the building. The windows shattered inwards, spraying glass and snow. The lights flickered, went out, and then the emergency lamps came on, bathing the operating room in a sickly, green light. A machine gun opened up right outside the main entrance. A high, ripping sound. It was an MG-42. They were at the door. A medic, a young woman from the Red Cross, her uniform stained black with blood, screamed, pointing to the wounded lying near the entrance. There were only 3 combat-ready men left inside, an exhausted officer with a bandaged leg, me, and Davies, who had just finished rigging the generator. "Davies! Get on the windows! Use your carbine! Fire at anything that moves!" I grabbed a discarded bar, Browning automatic rifle, heavy, comforting, and packed with serious stopping power. I crawled to the main entrance, finding cover behind a pile of stretchers. The German advance was brutal. They weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting because they had orders to eliminate all resistance. I saw a shadow detach itself from the freezing fog. A German corporal, his helmet low, MP-40 ready. He didn't see me. He was focused on the wounded officer. I didn't hesitate. The bar bucked violently in my hands, spitting a long burst of fire. The corporal went down instantly, collapsing onto the snow, his weapon skidding across the threshold. The smell of cordite filled the air, acrid and suffocating. This wasn't logistics. This was primal. This was protecting the resources, the wounded men, that represented the American will to continue. We held the doorway for 10 agonizing minutes. The Germans, realizing the school was fortified, switched their attack to the main perimeter, leaving us relatively alone. When the noise subsided, I was shaking, the adrenaline draining away, leaving me cold and empty. I had killed 3 men that morning, not in a grand maneuver, but in a messy, close-quarters brawl to protect a pile of gauze and a sputtering generator. I looked at Davies. He was leaning against the wall, dry-heaving, his face ghostly white. "I got them, Mac. I got 2 of them," he whispered, disbelief in his voice. "You did fine, son," I said, laying the bar down. My hands felt clumsy and foreign. "Now get back to the generator. If that thing dies, these men freeze." I returned to my calculation sheets. The human cost was now tallied not just in casualty reports, but in the exhaustion written on the faces of the living. The cold, the lack of sleep, the constant noise, it was all designed to break us down into disorganized fragments. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me more than the Belgian winter, that we could not hold out much longer. No amount of heroism or stubbornness could change the fundamental logistical reality. Without fuel, without food, without shells, the 101st would become a legend, but they would be a dead legend. We needed a miracle, and the sky remained resolutely gray. Christmas Eve. The lowest point. The Germans, insulted by the nuts' response, unleashed a hellish attack of coordinated armor and infantry. The air was a maelstrom of steel and noise. We could hear the terrifying rumble of tanks fighting only a few blocks away. The town was being systematically destroyed. The beautiful old church steeple, which had served as a grim landmark, was hit and collapsed in a dusty cloud of ancient stone and wood. In the cellar, morale was crumbling under the constant pressure. The radio was a torment, static and whispers of other American units desperately trying to link up, only to be cut off by German patrols. I was staring at the last supply sheet. 105mm shells, 10 per gun remaining. Fuel for generators, 4 hours. Morphine, 0. McAuliffe stood over the map, his face etched with exhaustion, his jaw tight. He was planning a counterattack, an insane, final gamble to try and expand the perimeter and link up with any relief column, but his eyes told the story. He knew they didn't have the resources to sustain it. The psychological toll was enormous. The soldiers, freezing in their foxholes, were resorting to desperate measures to stay warm, burning captured German paybooks, anything that would ignite. They were fighting frostbite and dysentery as much as they were fighting the Wehrmacht. I walked over to the general, carrying the final logistics summary. "General, we can't sustain another 24 hours of this intensity. If we commit the last shells to this counterattack and the relief doesn't arrive, we will be completely exposed." McAuliffe looked at the paper, then tossed it back on the table. "McAllister, your numbers are accurate. But numbers don't fight battles. Men do. We hold because if we don't, the entire plan fails. Patton needs time. We are buying him that time with our frozen asses." He was right, of course. Bastogne was no longer a tactical objective. It was a strategic clock. Every minute we held was a minute gain for the main American war machine to shift its weight. We were the sacrificial lambs, slowing down the slaughter. I stood there, feeling the full, crushing weight of American logistics failure. It wasn't the logistics of beans and bullets that failed. It was the failure of operational intelligence, the self-delusion that the enemy was incapable of action. We paid for that arrogance in the blood and ice of the Ardennes. Later that evening, the most agonizing event occurred. A radio message, faint and full of static, broke through the German jamming. Relief column, advancing north from Arlon, encountering heavy resistance, expect delays. The relief was coming, but it was bogged down. They were fighting the German outer defenses, suffering heavily. We were going to have to hold through the night. The worst night of the year, the coldest, the night when hope should have been highest. I found Davies huddled in the corner, trying to warm his hands over a small candle stub. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Mac," he whispered, "I heard the report. Are we going to make it?" I sat beside him, offering him the last half of my frozen chocolate bar. "We have done everything right since the start of the encirclement, Davies. We followed orders, we conserved resources, we fought back. Now, the math is over. It's not about what we have left. It's just about existing until sunrise. It's about being too stubborn to die." The shelling resumed, closer now. I could hear the roar of the German armor pressing against the defensive line, trying to find the point where the American will finally shatter. I gripped the cold stone of the cellar wall. If the sky didn't open up soon, if the weather didn't clear for the relief drops, nuts would become the epitaph for the 101st Airborne. December 26, 1944. Early morning. I was on the perimeter, helping a group of engineers reinforce a collapsed trench near the eastern approach. The cold was unbearable, an enemy more persistent than the SS troopers. The snow had stopped, but the fog was denser than ever. We were waiting for the inevitable final assault. The previous night had been a nightmare of close-quarters fighting, with tanks nearly penetrating the line 3 times. Every man felt the end was near. We were operating on raw nerves. My carbine was frozen. I had to smash the butt against a tree stump to loosen the mechanism. We were running dry on everything, even morale. And then I heard it. It wasn't a shell. It wasn't an MG-42. It was a sound that had been absent for 5 long, miserable days. A deep, steady, powerful sound, not of the ground, but of the sky. I looked up. The sky was still gray, choked with freezing mist. But the sound was persistent. It grew louder, a familiar, comforting drone. It was the synchronized, rhythmic roar of radial engines. Dozens of them. And then, for a brief, magical moment, the dense cloud layer parted. Not for long, just a shimmering, crystalline gap. And through that gap, they came. They were P-47 Thunderbolts, massive, beautiful American fighters, their silver wings glinting in the pale winter light. And behind them, a squadron of C-47 transports, heavy with cargo. The sight of the planes was not just tactical relief. It was a profound, spiritual intervention. It was the physical manifestation of the American industrial power we had been told to believe in. It was Detroit, Michigan, reaching across the Atlantic, reaching through the clouds, and delivering salvation. The P-47s immediately swept down, engaging the few German fighters that dared to challenge them, but mostly focusing on the ground troops, clearing the perimeter, blasting the German assembly areas with rockets and cannon fire. The sound of their guns was music. Then the C-47s began their work. Parachutes, heavy with supplies, bloomed across the sky, brilliant white against the gray. Supplies for the 101st. I watched, tears blurring my vision, as massive bundles of ammunition, gasoline cans, food pallets, and most importantly, medical supplies, drifted down towards the besieged town. The German response was frantic, but too late. Their logistical strategy, relying on the weather to negate American air superiority, had failed at the very last moment. The sky, our true ally, had finally opened its doors. The air support and the successful airdrops turned the tide instantly. not just tactically, but psychologically. The supply problem was immediately, if temporarily, solved. The men knew they weren't alone anymore. The fight was back on. But the real breakthrough came later that afternoon. I was back in the command post, supervising the sorting of the retrieved airdrops, a logistical miracle in itself, when a tremendous, sustained roar erupted from the south. This was not the muffled, long-range sound of distant combat. This was heavy, close, American thunder. It was Patton. The 4th Armored Division had finally broken through the German lines, smashing their way north, ignoring all standard operational procedure in a ferocious, concentrated push. I ran outside to witness the event. The sight was intoxicating. The first tank to enter the town was a Sherman, mud-caked and scarred, its tracks chewing up the frozen road. It was followed by a relentless column of American steel. The contrast was absolute. The defenders of Bastogne were scarecrows, exhausted, filthy, wrapped in layers of blankets and rags, their eyes burning with fever and exhaustion. The men of the 4th Armored Division were different, cleaner, fresher, their tanks painted in sharp, aggressive camouflage. They were the relief. The hammer. I saw the commander of the lead tank, a young lieutenant, stick his head out of the turret. He looked at the bearded, gaunt men of the 101st staring at him. He didn't salute or cheer. He just nodded, a grim acknowledgement of shared hell. The relief column poured into the city, immediately linking up with the defenders, securing the road, and opening the main supply route. The siege was over. The trap had been sprung, but the quarry had held the trap open long enough for the trappers to arrive. I didn't feel elation. I felt the profound, aching exhaustion of having held the line past the point of human capacity. We hadn't won a glorious victory. We had simply refused to lose. Days later, the battle was still raging around the edges of the bulge, but Bastogne was secure, serving as the spearhead for the American counterattack. The Germans, having overextended themselves, were now fighting for their lives in the pocket they had created. The entire operation, the last, grand spasm of the Wehrmacht, was doomed the moment the sky cleared over Bastogne. I stood in the now bustling, repaired command post, looking at the large, clear map. The red arrow of the German thrust had hit the solid blue circle of Bastogne, and had been broken. My job was to calculate the cost. The human cost was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge would prove to be the most costly single action for the U.S. Army on the Western Front. The price of complacency was high. Davies, finally looking rested, walked over, a fresh cup of real coffee in his hand. "We made it, Mac. We actually made it. They failed. They lost their bet. They lost their bet because they were fighting against the ultimate resource, Davies," I said, looking out the shattered window at the endless convoy of tanks and trucks now rolling through the town, the American logistical pipeline, finally uncorked. They thought they were fighting men running on low fuel and low morale. They calculated that terrain and weather would neutralize the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh. They were right about the first part. For 5 days, we were running on empty. I sipped the coffee, the warmth spreading through my chilled body. But they made one fatal logistical error, Davies. They forgot that the supply line doesn't just run from the factory to the front line. The most critical supply line runs from a man's brain to his frozen feet. They pushed us until the professionals broke, until the resources failed, until the rational choice was surrender. And then we simply reached into the reserves of the human animal, the stubbornness, the stupidity, the sheer, unreasoning will to say nuts to the entire situation. I tapped the map where Bastogne stood, a tiny, defiant island. The logic of the war was that we should have collapsed. But the ultimate victory, Davies, is not about the logistics of steel, but the logistics of the human will. We had just enough of that resource to hold out until the rest of the machine caught up. That's why we won here. because we knew deep down that we could afford to lose a battle, but the Germans couldn't afford to fail at a breakthrough. I picked up my logbook, turning a fresh page. The work never ended. The next mission, processing requisitions for thousands of pairs of wool socks and thousands of gallons of high-octane gasoline. The quiet had returned to the Ardennes, but it was not the deceiving silence of the ghost front. It was the heavy, exhausted silence of victory, paid for with the lives of thousands, and guaranteed by the stubbornness of a few men who, when faced with overwhelming annihilation, chose to be completely, stupidly, American. We had survived the bulge. The world could now thaw out.